Good morning. I want to start by telling you about an interesting man that I read about recently, a guy by the name of Rex Walcher. Now, Rex was a mechanic who became a preacher, kind of an interesting career change. But Rex had this problem where the church where he worked, like many churches, didn't have great attendance on the Wednesday evening study time. There were a church of about 175 people, and there'd be like a third of that, let's say, there on a typical Wednesday evening. And one of the things Rex thought was maybe people aren't able to come because there's just too much stuff going on. And so he had this idea that if he cooked, then people would just come, eat, and stick around for Bible study. Fairly simple idea, often been done in other places. But something really interesting happened in Rex's congregation. People did start to come, and in his own words, by the way, this is funny because it tells us that every church is kind of the same, right? He said he went and found the cooking elite in his congregation. And I wonder how often, most of us in many congregations could identify those. So anyway, he found the cooking elite, and he asked them for a little help and guidance in how he should approach this particular situation. And very quickly, the attendance jumped quite a bit. All right? And so Rex began to cook and have some food there ready, and people started to come. And really, right away, he ended up with, about 150 compared to, his previous 40 or so that would be showing up. But that's not all. Rex had a family, like many people do, and so in order to manage his own schedule, he would pick up the kids from school, bring them to the church, and he would just cook. Well, the kids had to eat anyway. That's why they were there. They could help a little bit. They could eat. Worked out well. His kids, though, began to bring other kids. And so he started having a bunch of kids. And so he'd feed the kids and then have Bible study. Well, somebody in town somehow figured out that there were some kids. So other people who had nothing to do with the situation, kids just started showing up around 5 o'clock at the church and coming in, and he would invite them in, and they would be able to eat. And this gave him an idea, so he thought, maybe what we could do is we'll come over after school, we'll have a short Bible study, and then the kids can help me set up, we'll get everything ready, and then everyone comes, they have their full Bible study. So that started happening. Well, let me make this long story short, okay? Before long, they were having about 180 people show up on Wednesdays. As you can tell, that's more than the average, that's more than the numbers of their congregation, because people were just showing up off the street. They had kids from 1 all the way up to high school, and so they had to find teachers to take classes for all of these kids. And what started out as, just his effort to get a few more people to show up for Wednesday evening turned into a major ministry for this particular congregation, involving, all kinds of people and all kinds of planning and organization. In fact, he said, he shared a couple of helpful tips that I thought would be a little bit humorous. He said, one thing you can't do if you're going to do this in your church is let the younger people cook, because they blow the whole budget for the month on one meal, where if you get the older people to cook, they can stretch that budget out for the whole month and then have money left over at the end. The other thing he pointed out was that what they were ultimately able to do is register as, I guess in their state, which was Oklahoma, in their state, if you're a soup kitchen, then you get certain benefits and opportunities to buy large quantities of food that other people don't get. So ultimately they registered as a soup kitchen and were able to bring in more food for a lower price, and of course more people from the community. Now, I tell that story because what I want to talk about today is sowing the seed. And I want to talk about this in preparation for what we're going to do next Saturday. You may recall that this coming Saturday morning at 9:30, we're going to get together and try to share some ideas about how we could be more effective at evangelism, at sowing the seed. Okay? And so in preparation for that, I want to tell you about this one church and something that they did. Now, I'm not suggesting that the same thing would work in every single church everywhere, but I am telling you this story to demonstrate that when you do something, often it turns into far more than what you had initially anticipated. Right? Our friend Rex, he wasn't planning on having any kids there at all, and he ended up having like 5 different classes. Right? He wasn't planning on having anyone from the community at all. But he ended up having as many from the community as he has from his own congregation. And so, when it comes to thinking about how we're going to sow the seed, how we're going to share the gospel, it's important for us to understand that, we don't want to take this word evangelism and pigeonhole it to mean just one thing. Okay, for this church in Oklahoma, a big part of their evangelism is their Wednesday evening service. Okay? And for some other church, and I'm sure if we went through the room, we could tell stories about other churches, right, and various things that they're doing. Okay, so first, let's establish something that's fairly simple. Okay? When it comes to the efforts of the church to share the gospel, that needs to be a corporate effort. Okay, everyone needs to be involved in that. Now, I don't mean everyone needs to, stand up here and preach a sermon all the time, right? But I will say this: any church that's going to be effective in sowing the seed of the kingdom is going to have to involve everyone in that effort. All right. Passage we're all very familiar with. Okay, we all know the Great Commission. Right? Can anyone even tell it to me? If you're not comfortable, I've got it here. I can read it to you. But right, go into all the world, right? And make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I'm with you always to the end of the age. You might also recall Luke chapter 19 and verse 10, where we're told that the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. And from these passages and many others, okay, we could establish that, hey, one of the primary emphases, one of the primary tasks, in fact, of the church is to sow the seed, right? Is to share the good news about what God has done. Okay. Now, I dare say, and in fact, when we did a survey and talked about this, many in the group believe that. But I have this suspicion that while we all feel strongly about the need to spread the gospel, to share the good news, to evangelize, we sometimes, I suspect, read into that word a lot of stuff that isn't necessarily there. So that when we hear it, we kind of associate it with some negativity and some discomfort. It's almost like, if you had raised kids, or if you're raising them now, if you say to your children, it's time to do your homework, right? They probably don't jump up and down and cheer for joy. You probably get, do we have to do this again? Well, sometimes when the word evangelism gets brought up, you can sort of see the looks on Christians' faces. Oh, I know we're supposed to do it, but it's so uncomfortable, and it's so much nicer to just, hear about how great we are and how wonderful Jesus is and all the good stuff he's done, and not ask us to respond in any way, because that response stuff is kind of hard, right? I think part of the reason we associate difficulty with evangelism is because we've made it more difficult than it needs to be. And oftentimes, not very natural. Okay? Let me give you a really simple example. And this is a real-life example. Okay? And it's just an aside, okay? But it'll help to make the point. Who here knows what a naloxone kit is? Familiar with that a little bit? So a naloxone kit is, well, naloxone is a drug that can treat overdose, especially when someone has, I guess it can treat any opioid overdose, right? Whether it be prescription Demerol or heroin or, of course, the dreaded fentanyl. Okay. Well, did you know that naloxone kits are available for free at any pharmacy? A lot of people didn't know that. And I would suggest if you have first aid training and you have a first aid kit, you should, right, take advantage of that, walk into Rexall, or I got mine a while back from Rexall, so I know they have them. I haven't checked at IDA. But walk in there, tell them that you'd like a naloxone kit. She'll give you a little bit of instruction and give you one, and you can drop that in your first aid kit, and you've got it, right? Not necessarily even for someone else. You might go to help someone else and be exposed to fentanyl yourself. Okay? Now, that has nothing to do with the gospel or Jesus, right? But it's a very simple little piece of information that's helpful that I can share with you, and everyone goes, yeah, that is not a bad idea. Hey, that's a pretty decent thing to do. Okay? Well, when we're talking about Jesus and who he is and what he means and about our church and our church family, it doesn't have to be this horrible, difficult, awkward thing. It can be as simple as me just telling you that little bit of news that maybe some people weren't aware of. Right? That's all it needs to be. And I would suggest to you that you don't need to have any special degree in theology, and you don't have to be, the most silver-tongued orator who's ever lived to tell somebody about a piece of good news, a piece of helpful information. If you look in Acts chapter 8 and verse 4, this is just after Paul has really sort of ramped up his persecution of the church. It said the Christians were scattered. And when they were scattered, what did they do? Can you remember? Yeah, they went everywhere preaching the gospel. Okay. Now, of those people who were scattered and went everywhere, how many of them do you suppose got a crowd of people together and got a pulpit like this and prepared a 3-point message with a poem at the end? Right? How many? Probably none, right? It doesn't need to be that difficult. Right? We know, and we can read in the New Testament about all kinds of great examples of people who were preachers and who did deliver sermons. Okay? But that's certainly not the only way that the gospel was shared. In fact, I doubt any of the people we read about in Acts chapter 8 and verse 4 did what we would think of as, sharing a gospel sermon or presenting a sermon at all. Right? They just talked about who they were and who Jesus was and why that mattered. Anyone in here talk about stuff? Now listen, every once in a while I go through the McDonald's drive-thru and I know, okay, that some of you talk about stuff because I can see you in there having your chat and having a coffee and whatever else. All right? And so maybe you talk about sports, or, if you're really brave, you talk about politics or the news or kids or, whatever else is going on. Well, one of the things I would suggest we can do to be more effective at evangelism is just talk about stuff that's going on with the church. Talk about a news story that relates to some matter of religion. I think sometimes we, and as I talk with people about evangelism and outreach, the first thing they start asking me about is what I would call like debate questions, right? They're getting ready for a fight. And one, I'm not sure how effective that's going to be. But two, I don't think evangelism needs to be that way. Okay, sure, there may be a time when someone challenges you on a particular point. But long before that, we can probably have some good, helpful, meaningful conversations about who God is and what that means and about the role he plays in our lives. Okay? In fact, let me take this one step further. I would suggest that evangelism needs to take various forms. Okay? Because when we read the Great Commission earlier, who are we supposed to go to? The whole world. Everybody, right? Now, it would be great, although we need a much bigger building, if all of Meaford, right, just came in here on Sunday morning and I could share the gospel with them. Right? That'd be fantastic. But not very likely, is it? All right? So if I'm going to share the gospel with everyone in Meaford, is it going to work for me just to stand up here and share it every week? No, because I'm going to miss a whole lot of people, right? But if you took a few different approaches, maybe there was a sign or a website or something on the radio or, however many things we could name, right? If we started going around the room, we could come up with a bunch of stuff where if we put this information in all kinds of different sources, perhaps there would be a chance that we could reach every single person in Meaford. I know a guy. Now, this is new information, okay? So I met Wayne Berger a number of years ago when I was in Denver taking a class. But since that time, Wayne still helps at Bear Valley Bible Institute, but he's also working with a congregation. It was a small congregation, a smaller congregation when he started. Now, when this article was written, which is a year and a half or so ago, the church had 44 people. It's in a small town called Conifer, Colorado. Now, I will say this. I bet it doesn't have 44 people now. But Wayne came into this situation, a small church, not a lot of resources, not very well known. One of those towns where if you said, hey, where's the Church of Christ? Most people would be like, the what? Right? But he came into town and wanted to make sure that that church was sowing the seed. Okay? And so he took a few steps that he thought would help that small church to do that. And by the way, the whole church, various members are involved in various of these strategies. But that small church in Conifer, Colorado, first they made a brochure that they could just pass out. Like, just this is who we are, this is kind of what we're about. Very simple, something that anybody could just hand to a friend or neighbor. They made a website and a Facebook page. Right? They got permission from local businesses to use their parking lots. There are a couple of big supermarkets in town, and they got permission to use their parking lots to put on events. Right? Maybe they'd do hot dogs one day, and everyone who came and got a hot dog, they'd hand out one of those little brochures. They got permission to put things under the windshields. I'm sure you've been parked somewhere and gotten something under your windshield wiper, right? They started an email list. Now, this is interesting. We have an email list. It's our emails. This was different, though. They started an email list where they would ask people's permission. By the way, you have to do that these days, okay? To say, hey, would you like to receive like a devotional email every so often? And so they started making a list of people in their town, and they put their emails on the list. And then every month or month and a half, they would send out a little devotional email that had a little blurb at the bottom about where the church is and what the church does and that kind of thing. They got some students from a nearby school to run a VBS in one of their local parks. Right? They didn't run it themselves. They brought some people in to help. but of course it was their signage and all that kind of stuff. All right. They paid to put an article in the paper about once every other month, so like 6 a year. They host a couple of friends and family services a year. Now this one I thought was interesting. They volunteered to clean 2 miles of the highway. All right, they volunteered to clean 2 miles of the highway, and in exchange, they were able to put a big sign saying, you know, here's their church, this is where it is, and they cleaned this portion of the highway. Got a really prominent location. They joined the local Chamber of Commerce. And there are a number of other things that this small, at the time that this was written, this 44-member church in Colorado did. Now, just having gone through that list, there's a couple things that I find interesting. First, I bet you they have more than 44 people now. Okay? But, secondly, you know, these were all fairly small things. Right? No item on this list is just this big overpowering thing. In fact, most of the things are things that 1 or 2 people could handle all on their own. Right? They're all budget-friendly things. Right? None of these things cost a huge amount of money. They're all different things. Okay? That is, various people with various skill sets can be involved in this stuff. Right? You know, if your skill isn't, you know, talking with people face to face, you know, there are a lot of things on this list that you could help with and be involved with that wouldn't require that. And the other thing is, they even considered how much time would be required to carry out all the various things. So they tried not to get stuff that would be, you know, a whole full-time job to kind of carry on this ministry. So I tell you about that small church because I think it's a good example of a church who looked at their situation and said, you know, what can we do to sow the seed in a way that we can manage? Right? And I think that's important. For those of you who are farmers, I'll tell you that, you know, my grandfather did some farming when I was growing up. Now, he only had 60 acres. So when he was ready to sow a field, right, he didn't have a $500,000 seed drill, you know, pulled by a $300,000 tractor. That's not how he did it. And it wouldn't have made sense for him to use that approach, would it? Okay? By the way, that's changed now because now he just rents the land out and someone else does come in with a $500,000 combine and do all the work. But you got to look at your situation and you got to look at what kind of people you have and how they can be involved. And so this little church is a perfect example of, you know, being creative and thinking outside the box about how they could sow the seed. Right? And that's what I'd like to leave you with. To remember that God, and this is I think the challenge. I have a lot of books in my office that say something about church growth. Right? Now, what's interesting is if you went and read all those books, you'd find a different opinion in each one of them, which perhaps is one of the weaknesses of that whole area of study. But God didn't ask us to grow the church. Okay, growth is a secondary result. Okay, just like you planting a seed in the ground. When you plant a seed, do you have any control over what happens from that point on? No. Right? You know that if I'm consistent about it, there's a likelihood that I will get a crop. But really, the growth and development of that seed is not up to you. Just the planting of it is, and the watering. Okay? Well, next week, we're going to have a meeting to discuss ideas. And and determine how we might be able to be more effective in sowing seeds here in Meaford. And along those lines, we want your ideas. Right? We want your experiences. We want insights that maybe you've gained by traveling to another church or reading an article or seeing some effort that worked well in some other area of your life. Okay. Now, by the way, I want to share here that the idea is not to put anyone on the spot. Okay, I think one of the things that sometimes people get a little bit afraid of is that if they say, hey, what about this idea? Someone will say, that's a great idea. Why don't you go ahead and do that? Okay. I don't want anyone to be put off by that. Now, of course, I would never turn anyone away, and I do think all of us need to be involved. But that's not the purpose of this meeting. This meeting is to determine some really good strategies, some really good tools that we can implement to do a better job of sharing the seed in Meaford. And so at 9:30 on Saturday, I hope you'll come on over. We'll be here at the building. We'll eat something, and then we'll take some time to discuss these things together so that we can, through that effort, be as effective as possible in doing the thing that God has asked us to do, which is to sow the seed of the kingdom.